The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry.
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide.
Well, welcome to The Divide. We're here today with Nick Fish, president of the American Atheists. And Nick, glad to have you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
So how many people are in the American Atheists?
That's a difficult question to answer. We have something like 6,000 to 8,000 members. We've got, 25 to 35,000 people that take part in our action alerts, and we've got 50,000 who get our updates, and then another 500,000 or so that engage with us and follow us on social media. So it's a complicated question, but I think I answered it in every possible way that someone can answer it. So.
All right. So Nick, the question we have for you today is that we want to know, at what point is it acceptable for the government to sort of override someone's conscience? Like, take, for example, the cake baker case. Was that, in your opinion, was that a case that was argued properly on the side of those who were arguing against the cake baker, that he should have been forced to bake the cake? And what does that say about broader issues like this?
Yeah, this is one of those questions that is, I think, going to be the defining question in civil rights law and in our cultural understanding of how we work as a pluralistic society for this generation, or for at least this decade. These questions of conscience, though, have been asked and answered throughout America's history. You don't have to look very far back to look for these same reasons that God said, or the Bible says, that X should happen, that the races should be separate, or that there shouldn't be a mixing of the races, used to justify anti-miscegenation laws, or used to justify opposition to the Civil Rights Act that required people to serve all folks of different races at their public accommodations like restaurants and hotels and whatnot. Those questions have been asked and answered by the Supreme Court. And the question of whether or not somebody can be forced to do something that is in violation of their conscience is, to me, a resounding yes. That when people enter the public square, when people engage in commerce, when they open their business to the public, there are certain rules that you have to follow. And so the cake baker question boils down to this: what is it's called a but-for cause, if you're looking at the law. But for this one defining difference between two parties, what could we change that would make this, that would mean this person would decide to bake the cake, right? If the same person had walked into that cake shop and said, "I would like a cake, it's for my wedding to my wife," then he would have been fine. But if he walks in and says, "I would like this cake, the same cake, for a wedding for my husband," that's when we enter into a problem. And so what has happened there is, but for that person's sexual orientation, that cake baker would have engaged in the exact same conduct. Or would have baked the cake, or would have done the opposite, I should say. And that's the question. And that's what comes, that's what the stakes are when we're talking about these sorts of businesses that engage in commerce. The question of like artistic merit, are we forcing an artist to do something, is an interesting question. But when we're talking about a cake, especially in some of these cases, it's been a cake off of a menu, where you say, I want, here are the 5 choices that you have. Do you want a 2-tier, 3-tier, 4-tier cake? What color do you want it? And what flavors do you want it? There's artistry in baking, but there's also artistry in hairdos. And should a person be able to be turned away from a barber or a beautician or a makeup artist, to use the exact same term, because they're gay, or because they're Black, or because they're Jewish? We've already answered the question for 2 of those 3. And we've said definitively, no, you can't turn someone away simply because they're Black, or because they're engaging in an interracial marriage or an interfaith marriage. And so these LGBT issues are no different.
I forgot about the artistry angle on that
Mhm.
question, because it's been a few years since I've
Yeah.
read anything about that case. But I
There's
certainly don't know.
a really fun quote in the Supreme Court arguments about that, where I believe it was Justice Sotomayor asked the person defending the baker, could someone doing makeup or hair use the same arguments, and they said no. And she said, well, wait a second, you were talking about artistry. The term artist is literally in the name of the person doing makeup of their job title. So what's the difference here? And so, we're not talking about someone making a sculpture or painting a painting. We're talking about a cake.
Well,
and
it
we're
just
talking
always
about public
struck me
services.
as the kind of argument you get when lawyers sit around and form
That, and
the arguments.
that's certainly, a lot of what this is about is, we can talk here about the philosophical underpinnings of all of this and what all that means. But for advocates, for those of us that are engaged in public policy, the question we have to answer is, how do these principles interact with public policy and with real people's lives? And where does the rubber meet the road? And so that practical implications of some of these cases, that's where we have to focus. And we sometimes do have to make these very narrow, lawyerly arguments about these things, because that's how these issues get resolved in a civil society.
So the SCOTUS did actually rule at least once on this case, right? And I don't think it was I believe it was not in the direction, like, in other words, earlier that you were favoring. Isn't that correct? So you were saying
sort of. It's a more. It was a very narrow.
No?
Yeah, it was a very narrow decision. What they said in terms of, if we're talking about the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, what they said in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case was that an agency in Colorado that was charged with implementing Colorado's anti-discrimination law, that there's this committee, there's this body that reviews these cases. What they said is that a member of that committee, or two members, I don't remember the exact outcome here, engaged in speech that betrayed a type of animus against the baker. And what was said was essentially, one of the members of the committee essentially said, ex parte, so not in one of the proceedings, just sort of separately said, and it was actually after the decision had been rendered in sort of separate commentary, said something along the lines of, it's really disappointing when people use religion to justify discrimination, and that has no place here, which is, I would argue, certainly not a sign of animus toward religion generally, but more a statement of fact that in the past, people, as I mentioned, have used religion to justify discrimination of all different types, that they've used it to justify discrimination against LGBT people today, that they've used it previously to justify racial discrimination, that they've used it to justify anti-Catholic discrimination or Jewish discrimination against Jewish folks. That's a statement of fact. That's not a value judgment. That's simply a statement of America's history. So it was much more narrowly tailored. It didn't have anything to do with compelled speech about whether or not the government could hypothetically force a cake maker to do X, Y, or Z. It was entirely about this animus, which was kind of a punt on the part of the Supreme Court, but that's how the court works. It will take the narrowest procedural question first, and that's what they chose to do in this case.
So the fight is still on, so to speak, from both sides' perspective. Really, the crux issue has not yet been decided, is what you're saying. Yeah,
it's very much an open question. Again, I think we would argue that it isn't a fight or a question that's open anymore, that it was resolved in the 1960s and 70s. But on this particular expression of that question, then yes, it is still very much an open question that we're going to have to resolve. And even Justice Gorsuch, who is not necessarily somebody who we find a lot of agreement with on religious issues often, said in his Bostock decision, which was the decision expanding the Civil Rights Act and other laws to cover gender identity and sexual orientation, he said there are open questions here around religious liberty issues that the court isn't bringing up because the plaintiffs didn't invoke them in this case. And so even though under existing law, LGBT people are covered according to the Supreme Court case, and there's still some work that needs to be done there legislatively, but from the court's perspective, the existing law covers LGBT people in employment, certainly. He did sort of invite religious questions. And so no one has gotten all the way up to the Supreme Court with those questions yet, but it's only a matter of time. And so we need additional clarity in statutes, in the law, and we're going to certainly get additional clarity from the court. Whether or not that goes in a direction I would prefer is certainly an open question.
So Drew and I clearly could easily, our listeners know, get into the weeds of all the legal issues here. I mean, if you want to know the cases, right, Drew?
Yeah, it's funny, you know, like that's exactly where my mind goes. So I'm interested to hear what you're about to say, but like what I've been thinking this whole time is you could ask probably 100 different, you know, a million different specific questions about, well, okay, could you make the cake baker do this, or could you make the, you know, the person that drives a carriage, you know, do the, you know, or whatever the case may be, you know, the person that, you know, does guided tours of this or that, like, could you make them do it for this kind of a group? Or, you know, like, I'm just thinking of all these specific examples, to most of which, you know, I think the answer, or to some of which I think the answer would be clear cut, and to others which I would think it would be, you know, maybe even almost clear cut the other way. There's certainly things that you would not expect the government to force anyone to do,
I think
and some that you would. But yeah, I want to let you make your point, Bill. But that's the thing that has been, you know, running through my mind this entire time so far.
I mean, the entire country is founded on the principle of limited government, of trying to maximize liberty. So it's always a difficult argument to say you have maximum liberty, except the government's going to force you to do this. And of course, there's acceptable parameters for that. But when it comes to conscience, I think most people sort of feel like, well, you know, whatever the free exercise clause, however it's interpreted, whatever it means, the free exercise of religion clause, say, for example, which is enshrined in the First Amendment, obviously a pretty important part of the history of the nation. I, as a religious person, don't ever want to think of that clause as being a weapon that forces a secular person's conscience to be overridden, right? I don't want to think of it like that. I want to feel like people like Nick can live their lives in peace and freedom, and it's not for me or the government to tell him he can't do this or he's forced to do this when it's not really according to his conscience. But obviously, there's going to be just points of tension. There's no way there's not going to be. The question is the cake baker one of those type examples? And in other words, I think in the general public, it's generally the public is not in favor of the law being of overriding what they feel in their conscience they would otherwise do. I mean, it's just not going to be a popular argument generally in the culture. Now, when it comes to some issues, that's going to be totally different, right? If it's an issue of race, because of as Nick alluded to, he thinks this was all sort of settled in the 60s. It's now just a matter of fleshing it out. But I don't think the religious community, not the Christian community, is going to view it the same way. Of course, they're not going to review that the same way. They don't see LGBT issues as definitively the same. You know, they're not. They haven't been demonstrated to be the same as race. They may be, but they just haven't been. I mean, I'm just telling you how a lot of people, I think, would view it. So they'll tend to see it differently. But I'm curious, Drew, whether I mean, by the way, if I may sort of put my cards on the table a little bit, I think that I personally, as a Christian, and even though I definitely don't view, like a marriage between two men or two women as a marriage in the sense that I would understand the term. Okay, so I don't view it that way, not historically, not spiritually. I have an understanding that's connected to my sort of theological view of the world, everything, that marriage is very sacred and so on. So I view it a little bit differently. But at the same time, I think if I were the cake baker, I'd probably bake the cake. And I just as much as I think I would still attend a wedding of a friend or a coworker or something that was marrying their same-sex partner. So I still hold the traditional Orthodox sort of Christian view on marriage. But I don't like the idea. It's just uncomfortable to think the cake baker couldn't just say, no, I don't really want to. Like, he clearly had served, from what I read, unless you want to correct me, I think he had clearly made cakes for homosexuals in other contexts. It was because of the wedding. And that's
Right.
sort of where it's like, I don't like the idea of the government telling him he has to do that. But Drew, I'm curious what your position is on that. Just
well, that's where it gets back to my point about the specifics. I just find the specifics so interesting. And it's like, if the question is whether or not to bake a cake, I think, from something I read, and again, it's been a long time, he said, I'll be happy to make a cake. I'm just not going to like decorate it for a homosexual wedding. I could be completely wrong on that. I think he should 100% have to bake a cake. I think that shouldn't be up for grabs. I think the decoration is where it gets all squishy, and I don't know what the right answer is there. I think it depends on the type of business you do. I think it depends on the artistry question, like there are some jobs, if say you're an artist that paints portraits, maybe you have to do a portrait for anybody who wants their portrait, because you can't say, no, you're too ugly, I don't want to make your portrait, or whatever the case may be. But if you're an artist that does, interpretive landscapes of, and you don't want to do somebody's, picture of a landscape of Mars with Marvin the Martian on it, or whatever, like you can make those judgment calls. So it just seems that to me, the minutia of this, it is everything.
Yeah.
So the artistry is important, I guess, more than I thought. Go ahead.
Sillily, it sounds dumb to me to think of a cake baker as an artist, but if the question is, if
it's
you're
a message anyway,
you're an artist that chooses the type of art that you want to do, I think it's a difference. I don't know. I'm trying to play lawyer here, but
well, yeah, and this is the difficult question. That's what kind of getting back to what I said about the but for question, where if he would do the cake exactly the same for the same person, like the person who walked into his shop, if that person was marrying a woman, that if that man had been marrying a woman instead of marrying his husband, then that discrimination is but what is happening or wouldn't have happened but for the person that type of identification. And
which gets back to your point, Bill. Like you said, you probably would have just baked the cake, and it's kind of a question of like how narrow one's conscience is. Like you literally won't put the little man and the other man on top. If that's all it is, can we not come to some kind of agreement?
Right.
It's like, we'll just
just set it off to the side.
Well, yeah,
you can put it on
there
over
here in a bag, and you can pick out the ones you want, or
right.
it's just it gets a little silly to me when we're talking about the minutia, but that's everything. Like if he says, no, I'm not going to bake you a cake because you're gay, I don't think that's acceptable. Like,
right.
would you disagree with that?
Well, the question for a lot of this boils down to how do we build policy that in general encompasses the ordered running of a society. And like opening up this question to is it artistry opens it up to restaurants. I think that if you go to any high-end restaurant, people will say, you eat with your eyes first, right? And if you go to a really expensive restaurant with a tasting menu, and it's got beautiful plating and swoopy designs and everything looks great, and you want to hire that person to do your wedding, and they say, oh, that sounds fantastic, I've been wanting to do a wedding, and you're a person who's been to my restaurant many times and we're friends, and then you say, well, I'm also I'm marrying my husband, and they say, oh, well, in that case, because the swoopy designs on the plate are artistry, I can't do it. I'm not going to do it. It's against my conscience. The problem with that is, again, this is a question that's been asked and answered. That restaurants in particular are the definition of a public accommodation, and it's not hypothetical to say, should we allow someone who doesn't want to bake a cake or use their building or their hall that they rent out to the general public. We don't want to rent to an interracial couple. That's not a hypothetical. We're talking about stuff as late as the 1980s or late 1970s, early 1980s, when this was happening. This is not that long ago. And they used the same arguments. They said, the Bible says this, that, or the other, and we can certainly, I'm sure that Bill would disagree that the Bible justifies preventing the mixing of the races. But they weren't being cute with it. They weren't mischaracterizing their own beliefs. It was a sincere, deeply held belief, and they viewed this as, again, an endorsement that baking the cake or allowing you to use their hall or catering or allowing those folks to stay in their hotel, that was an endorsement in some way of the conduct of interracial marriage, which to them was a sin. And so, yes, we are certainly at a different place societally in the debate about LGBT people, but the arguments are exactly the same. And so when you're building out the law, that's what the question is. Have we answered this question before? Has the law protected people in the same way? There isn't something that's unique about LGBT people as far as the law would understand it, because it is an immutable characteristic that is a protected class and has been subjected to discrimination in many areas of society. Certainly not, and I don't want to draw an undue parallel to the types of discrimination that Black Americans have faced, because I don't recall ever being, enslaved for being gay. But it wasn't that long ago. It was the 1990s when sodomy was still illegal. Lawrence v. Texas, which is the law or the Supreme Court case striking down sodomy laws, was decided in the 1990s. This is not that long ago where it was illegal to engage in private relationships as a same-sex couple. And those laws were not widely enforced, but they were certainly weaponized against same-sex couples. It wasn't that long ago that the State Department was purging homosexuals from its ranks because they felt that it was a security risk, because it was, again, you could be held criminally liable for being gay. So they viewed it as a threat to blackmail, so you couldn't serve in levels of the government. Until the mid-2000s, you couldn't serve in the military. So, there is, and there continues to be, and there has been until very recently, massive amounts of discrimination against this particular community. And so the question is that community entitled to this type of protection? And I think that if you look at comprehensively the types of discrimination that people have faced and continue to face, the answer is yes, that these types of laws are intended to prevent people who have these views from weaponizing them against people who have no other choice. It's easy to say, well, just go to a different cake shop, or we're sort of trivializing it. But if if it's instead phrased as, well, find a different apartment, find a different job, that's something that people take issue with. And I will say the majority of Americans, 56% of Americans, and this is actually slightly down from the high of about 60%, 56% of Americans think that religion should not be used as an excuse to deny products and services to LGBT Americans, compared to only 35% who support it.
Now, this is just going to show my ignorance on the legal side, but you've kind of alluded to the protected class issue.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a settled thing? I mean, that's already been
in a number of states
into law, or
yeah, in a number of states, and
not federally though.
No, well, that was the question that was posed in the Bostock case that was decided this previous Supreme Court term in mid-2000, is whether or not the employment protections and the Civil Rights Act protections that cover gender also cover gender identity and sexual orientation. And the answer from the court in a 6-3 decision was yes. But LGBT status, sexual orientation, gender identity are not specifically mentioned in the U.S. Code. They are mentioned in sort of the administrative side, which is
so it's a precedent, not a law.
Correct.
It's a court. Yeah.
Right. But in states, in a majority of states now, I think it's 26 states. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but in a number of states, including New Jersey, where I'm from, including Colorado,
it's been encoded into the law.
Yeah, New Jersey has a very robust law that's been in place since the early 2000s called the LAD, the Law Against Discrimination, which prohibits discrimination in employment, in public accommodations, in business transactions, in contracts, and anything like that on the basis of a bunch of classes. And so that can be things ranging from age and race and religion to sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, HIV status, and so on. Unless there's what's called a bona fide employment reason for it, or if you're a religious employer. So if you're a church, your church can't be forced to hire somebody who is not, if you're a Catholic church, we're not going to force you to hire a woman to be your your minister, right?
So if that went to all 50 states, if that went federal or or state by state or whatever, I mean, would the American Atheists just close up shop? Would that be like done? would that sort of solve the issue? I mean, I know that's not your only issue, so I'm being facetious, but would that solve the problem? Would that basically put an end to this issue that we're discussing?
So it would solve parts of it, but we're still faced with questions of religious exemptions and loopholes, and exactly how far does that exemption for religious employers and religious employees apply? So, for example, other cases that have come up in this exact area relate to what's called the ministerial exemption. So, a recent Supreme Court case is called Hosanna Tabor v. I'm forgetting the rest of it, but Hosanna Tabor. People can look it up. Or Our Lady of Guadalupe was another one, where teachers at a K through 12 religious schools who were not what are called teachers, so they were not primarily charged with religious instructions. They were instead things like math teachers and English teachers, but would from time to time lead grace, for example, or would lead a one-off lesson about religious instruction, but were not charged with, they were not ministers of the faith in the way that they understood their jobs, and they didn't have ministerial qualifications. They were not educated as faith leaders. They were not. I mean, they're also women, so they're not ministers, certainly in the Catholic sense. And these are Catholic. One of them was Catholic. One of them was Lutheran. But one of these women was fired because she developed an illness, and they said, and I don't remember exactly what the illness was, but she said, I need some time off because I think it was cancer. And they said, actually, you're fired, which is terrible. And she sued. And then after she died of cancer, her estate continued the lawsuit. Another case was a woman who was, she reached a certain age, and the school said, sorry, we're done here. And she complained. And I think what happened in one of the cases as well was she filed a complaint with a government agency rather than going through the resolution process that was laid out within the school. And the school sort of turned around and said, aha, because you've filed this outside grievance, now we're firing you. That was the reason we're firing you, not because you have cancer. And so, these processes, I think people look at that and have this like visceral reaction to like, oh my gosh, this is a teacher who understood her job to be instructing people on English or math, and they were fired for these clearly discriminatory reasons. And the school said, well, sort of conceded, yes, we fired them for discriminatory reasons, but tough cookies, we're not covered under these employment protections because these were ministers of the faith, because they engaged in some small and admittedly small level of teaching kids at the school about their faith. And the school said that they, set an example of Catholic virtue and so on. And the courts agreed and said, yep, we cannot even begin to meddle with these decisions because they are at the core of religious freedom. And I don't think any of us, even, the most strident atheist, I would sort of include myself in that group, would ever say that the government can force, a Catholic church to hire as its reverend, as the person leading the church, a woman or somebody who isn't Catholic, right? Like that isn't even a question. A Jewish temple is not forced to hire a Methodist. They're not forced to marry a Methodist if they don't want to, obviously. That's not even a question. The question is how far does that extend? Does it extend to schools? Well, the Supreme Court has indicated that in some cases, yes, it does. Does it extend to hospitals? Because many religious hospitals view part of their essential mission as religious people to be taking care of the sick.
Could it be as simple as a public square issue? In other words, like where the church or even some nonprofit organizations, can't be held to the same standards as a business or, something like a school?
Yeah, I mean, that's how the Civil Rights Act is written, is that churches are not held to the same standards, that churches are free to discriminate in these ways. And that I think it's called like affiliated entities or something like that. So if you are like an auxiliary of the church, you also can have preference in hiring. You can't, however, discriminate in giving out services if you receive government funding. And that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, going back to what I said earlier, that a lot of these groups, because of the way we've set up a social safety net in the United States, a lot of these faith groups are the groups that provide sort of frontline services to people in need. So people in crisis, people needing homelessness or confronting homelessness, people who are hungry, people who are, fleeing a hostile situation in their home life, people seeking adoptions and foster care. These religious groups have stepped in because the government has not. And so religious groups have filled the gap. Well, and what has happened is the government has turned around and said, well, you've really built up, the infrastructure to take care of this. Let's give you some money to handle it. And the question becomes, okay, what is the play at the joints here of those competing interests, where, a Catholic hospital would argue that it has an interest in promoting Catholic virtue and living out its Catholic faith. So it doesn't carry out certain medical treatments, right? If you go to a Catholic hospital and give birth, even if you're not Catholic, they're not going to perform a tubal ligation after the birth, unless you have like some catastrophic reason to do so. They're not going to say, even if you have an ectopic pregnancy, unless that pregnancy is actively miscarrying, they will not institute, or they will not induce labor or perform an abortion. And that's the decision that we've made as a country about the play at the joints of those competing interests. However, a person who goes to the hospital and doesn't know that their hospital is Catholic, which has been the case, speaking for my own family, that happened with us. My mom had a cardiac event and was taken to a hospital that I didn't know until years later was a Catholic hospital. Now, she obviously didn't need a tubal ligation or an abortion or anything like that. But
you're really bad doctor.
It would be a very strange decision there. But there's like this list of procedures that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, through their medical ethics committee, will not allow Catholic hospitals to perform. Even if it's in the medical best interests, in the judgment of the doctors, they still won't perform it. They're not allowed to perform it. And, not every doctor, not every nurse, certainly at that hospital, is Catholic. And so there's competing interests in multiple directions here. Now, the problem, or the thing where I think we can force, and to sort of put that in air quotes or scare quotes, people to engage in conduct that might otherwise be in opposition to their stated beliefs, is when the government is directly funding the provision of social services. So housing someone who's experiencing homelessness, feeding somebody who's hungry. If you're receiving taxpayer money to do that, you better be serving everybody. And I would certainly argue that if you're receiving that money from the federal government, you probably shouldn't be discriminating in your hiring and firing decisions. Like if you're a Catholic group, or you're a Protestant group, a Methodist group, or a Muslim group, or an atheist group that's receiving government money to do that, you should, in an ideal world, if I were, emperor for the day, you should spin off that into a standalone nonprofit entity that is accountable, that is transparent, that is bound by the same requirements for public accommodations as everyone else. That's my preference. Now, that's not the arrangement that's been made, but that's my preference.
Tempting as it is to want to address that last part, I want to kind of go back to the cake baker thing, way back to the analogy with the interracial marriage, because I think the way most people would probably view the interracial marriage issue, which, like, you're right, it wasn't that long ago, is that it was part of a larger trend of racism. It wasn't like you had people who thought of the races as completely equal in every single way, except it just wouldn't be good to have interracial marriage. I mean, it was part of the larger racist society. It was just, in other words, I think of that as sort of one thing. It might have lasted a slightly bit longer, it sounds like, from the Supreme Court ruling, as you said, I think about late 70s or early 80s, but it was still part of that larger problem. Mm-hmm. Whereas I don't think in this case of the cake baker, I think the evidence is all in the opposite direction, where it's not really the case that I think that people are thinking of him as sort of like bigoted toward all LGBT people and refuse to make cakes for LGBT people. But rather it related just to this, I guess, messaging, or maybe it is the artistry, which I dismissed earlier. But if I just may give a practical example on the other side, if Richard Dawkins decided to open a cake baking place, I guess, in his retirement, and I went in to get a cake for, I don't know, somebody who just become a Christian, and it was Jesus saves or something. I wanted the message Jesus saves on the cake, and Dawkins just kind of was like, "Hey, I'm an atheist. I don't really do Jesus save cakes, you know." I just personally would feel like I wouldn't want him to be forced to write something on the cake that he doesn't really like, doesn't agree with, and actually thinks is kind of problematic to society. Like, I wouldn't feel, not only do I not want him to feel forced to do that and to feel honest enough to just say, yeah, I'd rather not do that. I'd also feel like I don't want the government to force him to do that. So how is that? What's wrong with that scenario? And what's different?
Yeah, the distinction I would draw there is the specificity of the message. That, you know, if you're writing on a cake, and I don't know, I suppose I don't have a problem with you know, but the question goes back to would he make a Jesus saves cake, let's say, for an atheist who, you know, was getting it ironically? I don't know, but if the answer is yes, then he better be making that exact same cake for a Christian who's having it seriously. Now, this is a sort of
it gets into the artistry question, I think,
well,
because it's like, what
this is kind of a
message
sleight
will
of
you?
hand. Well, this is a sleight of hand that's often used, because we're not talking about
clear,
an endorsement of the message itself. We're talking about a cake.
Just to be
that's
clear, Nick, I'm really not.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, Nick, I really am not trying to do any kind of sleight of hand, because I haven't thought about it enough to be able.
No,
to do
I'm sorry.
like
To be clear, I'm not. I don't want to
Yeah.
impugn that onto you, but it is an argument that's been made by others that changes the argument or changes the question, because it isn't a cake that says gay marriage is fantastic and I love it. It's a cake that is, you know, that has some flowers on it. Now, the cake baker might be projecting an endorsement onto that. But when I walk into any wedding, I think when the average person walks into a wedding, they don't think to themselves, I'm really glad that this cake baker interviewed these people to make sure that they are upstanding citizens and like ready to go with marriage. What they think is, that's a really nice cake, and that's it. And a cake, though, that would say, for example, the argument that's always brought up, or the example that's always brought up in this case, is not Richard Dawkins doing a Jesus Save cake. It's a Jewish cake baker being asked to do you know, a swastika, for example. And, you know, that's like taking it to the extreme, which is sometimes helpful in these situations, is to go all the way to the extreme and then walk back and see kind of where that line is. The question there is, or the problem with that example is that being a Nazi is not a protected class in the United States. But if the defining question here is of artistry and is of, you know, should that person be forced to do a particular message to endorse that? And it maybe a more helpful example would be, you know, sometimes you see like bachelorette party cakes that are rather profane, right? That have, you know, the male genitalia full display in a cake. Somebody could say, listen, I don't do that kind of cake, and be completely within their rights to do that, as long as they don't do that cake for a bachelorette party for, you know, a bunch of bridesmaids coming in and isn't that funny? But they also don't do it, if they don't do it for the gay bachelor party, then they're fine, because it's not that they're doing it on the basis of sexual orientation.
The crucial issue is, do you make that kind of cake, or do you not make that kind of cake? And if you make that kind of cake, you better make it for anyone.
Yeah, if you make wedding cakes, you got to make them for everybody, because it's not saying I endorse this marriage, it's making a wedding cake.
And if you make, you know, cakes with messages on them, then, you know, you have to make, you know, you have to have a class of messages you won't put on there, I guess. And you say, I don't make
Drew,
that.
To be clear, you're saying that you do think the government should be able to force the guy to make the cake and put the two little guys, you know, I guess, or whatever, on top of the cake. Just assume that's sort of standard. So you're saying you think the government should be able to force them to do that. They haven't done that yet, right? But you're saying you think they should rule in that direction?
The part that I am slightly unsure about is what message, you know, or decorations should be part of the cake maker's business, part of their job. And if there's any artistry involved or any kind of like, this is the kind of cake we will make, this is the kind of cake we won't make, what's acceptable in that, that's where it gets into like 1,000 questions, in my opinion.
Right.
Whether or not they make the cake, I don't think should be up for debate. I think they should make the cake, make the wedding cake, which they sell wedding cake, so they have to make a wedding cake if you want to go in there and buy a wedding cake. I don't think any question should be asked at that point. I think the question comes into play when it's talking about what do you want this cake to look like? How do you want me to craft this or art or artfully design this? And they should maybe, I don't know about that part. I really don't think that I think there should be limits there. I don't know what the limits should be.
Right.
I mean, if the cake baker is anything like Franz and Father of the Bride, it turns out that the cake is pretty important. It's a pretty important part of the celebration, and there's a big, I don't know.
Do you disagree with me that they should?
That I want the government doing this.
Do you disagree with me that they should at least be required to provide a wedding cake, even if it's an undressed wedding cake, because they are a shop that makes wedding cakes?
No,
I don't disagree.
Not for a gay marriage. I don't think they should be forced to be able to do. I don't think they should be forced by the government to do that. I think they should be forced to provide cakes to all people.
That's
like
what I mean.
Gay, whatever, regardless. But for the occasion of the wedding, I think of that as different. Like I don't
understand why they even need to know or get to ask what the occasion is. I mean, the question is, you provide this product, make me this product. I want to purchase this product from you. It doesn't have to. The transaction.
Maybe I want a 3-tier flowered cake that looks a lot like a wedding cake, but it's actually just for my bar mitzvah. Like that. It's the same cake. It's just for a different thing. Like that's the defining characteristic, is that they would make the cake if not for the fact that it was for a same-sex wedding.
I tried to give a counter analogy of where I was trying to be consistent with the Dawkins example, which I just thought of off the top of my head. But but all I was trying to do was just try to say, I mean, if someone's conscience just isn't comfortable doing something in this specific incident because they don't agree with my beliefs or practices or whatever, I guess I just don't really think of like, I'm going to get the government to force them to do that any more than, Drew, if you owned a community center and you said, yeah, really passionate about what I'm doing with this community center. We've got the artists coming in on Friday nights, and we have an AA, not American Atheists, but AA meeting on Saturday nights. And we've got, and then we do have the American Atheists on Sunday nights, and then you tell me, yeah, some Campus Crusade people came and wanted to rent it out. And I was kind of like, it's not really my passion, is to promote, Christian proselytization. And I would tend to think, well, I don't want the government forcing you to have to do that. I actually have no idea what the laws are. I just don't think the government should be forcing you to use your building that way, The law is that they would have to accommodate them, that you would give them the same rates, and you got to do that.
Yeah. It's the same in schools.
But will they really? I mean, like practically speaking, do people really want to? I don't know.
I think that's
people sue all the time about this. I mean, the rule, the law that's in place. I'm completely blanking on the name right now, but there's a law that requires equal access. I think it's actually called the Equal Access Law in federal education, that requires schools. And this isn't quite the example of, if Drew opened up his own.
Yeah, I was talking about his privately owned community center.
But that's a public accommodation. That is the definition of a public accommodation.
I mean,
and if we allow discrimination on the basis of religion, if we say, Drew, as a non-believer, if you don't want to have Christians, but you open yourself up to the public, that's a choice that you've made. Right, opening yourself up to the public.
The issue to me.
But a church, by the way, is exempt from that. So if your Methodist church doesn't want to house, the weekly meeting of your local atheist group, because you're a church, because you're not a public accommodation, you're exempt. Yeah. But if you are a public accommodation, if you hold yourself out as a business that engages in public commerce, then yeah, you do have to. And I would absolutely 100%, if American Atheists decided to open up its doors to outside groups, and we said, it's free to rent. If a Christian came to us and said, I would like to host my Bible study here, and by the way, I'm going to pay you, we're going to do all the same stuff, we would be obligated under the law we would be treated as a public accommodation, since we've held ourselves out as such, and we would be required to do so. We couldn't decline to host their event for those discriminatory reasons. Now, we could turn around and say, actually, we're already booked on Mondays. Sorry. Or you want to have, 500 people here. We only have space for 50.
People do every day, which people do every day in America in order to avoid the conflict.
Absolutely
right?
true.
Because there's
Absolutely
a difference between what of course, I wasn't talking about what I would do. I was talking about what I wouldn't want the government to be able to force Drew to do. And yet all three of us are going to be in total agreement that we don't, as a general principle, we want the laws to, we're not interested in promoting discrimination. We don't, we want the laws to protect individuals as much as possible. So I'm in agreement with that. I know they can be abused. I know these things have been abused, but I'm uncomfortable with the degree to which people are wanting to use the government to force what I think are fairly exceptional violations of conscience. Now, I mean, the cake bake is that's a very narrow issue, because it's not really baking cakes for gays. It's not, certainly not even like the interracial marriage, in my opinion. It's it has a very narrow application, and I'm not real comfortable with it, but
you're exactly right. I mean, this is an open
Supreme
question.
Court may rule on my side. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. And that's an open question, and it is being discussed. And, I think those of us that have looked at it and, are on sort of my side of the advocacy on it, that's why we draw the parallels in the way that we do. But it is an open social question. And the great thing about society and the American people and people in general, we don't necessarily always think about things in this like building out a cohesive, comprehensive, or even sometimes coherent positioning on things. We go by gut reaction. And so, I think that you're a very thoughtful person, and I know that you are, because we've spoken at length over the course of the last 4 years that we've spoken in on occasion. I know that you're a really thoughtful person, and I do think that people can disagree, and that there's room for communicating and having these discussions and, trying to convince people. The one thing that I'll add here is I think that when you engage in commerce, when you open yourself up, you hold yourself out as someone that serves the public, you do necessarily give up certain questions of conscience. You do give up certain conscience rights that you may have as a private individual, that you have in your own home, that you have in your, between your two ears, because you're holding yourself out in that way. And that's a play at the joints. That's a concession that we have long made as a society, as a way to address long-term discrimination. And so the question ultimately is, as you sort of implied, Bill, whether or not these cases are of the kind of the types of racial discrimination that we face, or if there's something completely new and different. I would argue that they're akin and very parallel to the types of discrimination that interracial couples and interfaith couples have experienced over the years. That's the closest corollary. We can disagree with that, but if the question is, are we just going to throw away this entire regime that we've built in the society since the 1960s and even 50s of regulation on public accommodation and the use of the coercive power of government, then I think that's asking a lot. That's asking to overturn or throw out 60 or 70 years of law, which is a pretty big step to take. That goes to the heart of a lot of what we as Americans view as, how we've built our order, ordered our society.
I see it as throwing out an even deeper tectonic principle of the maximization of liberty and conscience and the restriction of governmental power. But let me say this: I think this is where I would agree with you. I'm not quite sure where Drew is on this, but I would completely agree, since we've kind of arrived at our divide, I think. But if it were the case that somebody, a homosexual couple went to, there's 10 cake baking services in the city of Denver, and they can't find one to bake them a cake, then I would feel like it is time for there to be an action of government that's coerced. I would feel like that was.
See, I think the difference between the way you're looking at this and the way I'm looking at this, Bill, is I don't see it as an imposition that's different from any other responsibility that a an entity would have if they're conducting business in the United States. I just think this is a requirement. I don't. If you offer you make baseball bats and somebody wants to buy a baseball bat, you don't ask them if they're going to use it to break down a door. You just sell them the baseball bat. And I don't think that's
quite true. I think there are a lot of complexities that get into conscientious use, depending on what you're doing. I mean, I'm not baking cakes for a living, so it's not. But I bet there's lots of little nuances about conscientious use. But anyway, we've got our divide. I think it's a big surprise that it's a divide. And at the same time, there's probably a lot of areas where we would agree on some things. I think that's pretty clear. And, I think maybe my bigger concern is sort of the what I perceive as demonization, the attempt to kind of personally destroy the cake baker rather than like treating him as if he's a sort of a closet bigot or an open bigot for that matter. I find that maybe more troubling than the legal issue at hand. And that has gone the other direction, meaning we're just at a point where the other side is the devil, no matter what the issue is. So at least we get to have a conversation where we're divided, and clearly we could enjoy one another's conversation as we will, I suspect, in the future.
Right. Well, and that's what I was just going to say about the having as long as you have a coherent position. If your position, Bill, is around concerns about the coercive power of government, that is that's a conversation that I welcome, and that I think that reasonable people can disagree on. I think that the evidence that's out there and that we looked at the time when we were passing the Civil Rights Act was, the question isn't what happens in Denver. The question is what with a restaurant. The question is what happens in the town that's 300 miles outside of Denver, where there's pharmacy, or where there's one restaurant, or where there's one hotel. And so we have to pass a law that
a good question.
That creates that. And by the way, what we've done with employers, for example, is there's a carve out, right? The Civil Rights Act only applies to employers with more than 20 people, with more than 20 staff.
Right.
State laws apply, like New Jersey's law applies to all employers. But those public accommodation laws often have similar carve outs and exemptions, and where those limits, where those where exactly that play at the joints happens is an open conversation. It's something that we always have. And I think that you're exactly right, that reasonable people can disagree about that. But I do think there is something when a person specifically says, I don't think that this is I don't think calling someone out and saying it's really a shame that that you're using religion in this way to discriminate. I mean, that's a statement, as we were talking about before this, that's a statement of fact. It's been used in this way previously. It's been used to justify a lot of discrimination in this country not too long ago. And so simply stating that fact, I don't think is animus against religion or an attack on that person. It's a statement of fact. And so
Drew, you want to have clear. Nick, first of all, thank you. Thanks for coming today. I'm going to give Drew the final word, but I just wanted to say real quick.
If I can just ask Nick one quick thing.
Go ahead. Fire away.
To be clear, are you just speaking in general, or are you saying that about the cake baker specifically? Because I'm not.
I'm saying in general. I think that there are questions that we can have the debate about.
Yeah, I think in general I agree with almost maybe everything that Nick said, and I think and I think one thing he said that I very much agree with is that, Bill, you are an open-minded and thinking person, and for all I know, this cake baker may be too, and just has some kind of internal conflict with the struggle of what do I believe is right. And so I think I think we all agree on that point. We all agree that there is a give and a take here, and that the vilifying of the other side is not particularly helpful. So I've really enjoyed having this conversation. It's made me a lot more knowledgeable about this, although I still feel like I have a long way to go on that. And maybe that's a healthy way to end.
Yeah.
Well, Nick, thanks again for being with us. I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, TheDividebyiPUB. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.